Gudauta Air Base, Georgian Soviet Socialist Republic, May 19, 1989, 10:47 p.m. Captain Aleksandr Zuyev watched 18 of his fellow pilots devour the strawberry cake he'd baked that afternoon. The sweetness masked something else. Enough sleeping pills to hospitalize them all. Around the cramped quarters of the 176th Fighter Aviation Regiment, men laughed and toasted his supposed good news. His wife was pregnant with a boy. They raised glasses of vodka. They slapped his back. They had no idea this celebration would be their last memory before waking in hospital beds, wondering why their captain had vanished along with the Soviet Union's most advanced fighter jet. Zuyev smiled and accepted their congratulations, feeling the weight of his Makarov pistol beneath his flight jacket. In less than 3 hours, he would cut the base's telephone lines. He would fight a guard in hand-to-hand combat. He would steal a $25 million MiG-29 Fulcrum. And he would either become the most famous defector since Viktor Belenko or die trying. The irony wasn't lost on him. The Soviet Air Force had trained him to be the best, to fly the most sophisticated interceptor in the Warsaw Pact arsenal. They'd trusted him with state secrets, with nuclear-capable aircraft, with access to classified NATO intelligence. Now that trust would become the instrument of his escape. Captain Aleksandr Mikhailovich Zuyev embodied everything the Soviet system claimed to produce. Born July 17, 1961, in the heart of the USSR, he'd been shaped by communist ideology from childhood. He graduated from the prestigious Armavir Higher Military Aviation School in 1982, his record spotless, his loyalty unquestioned. The Air Force assigned him to the 176th Fighter Aviation Regiment, where he flew the MiG-23M, a capable interceptor, but aging. When the regiment began transitioning to the cutting-edge MiG-29 in the mid-1980s, Zuyev was among the first selected. This honor, he later admitted, may have saved his life. Rumors swirled that the regiment might deploy to Afghanistan, where Soviet pilots were dying in mountain passes and desert ambushes. The MiG-29 program kept him in Georgia. The Mikoyan MiG-29, NATO reporting name Fulcrum, represented the pinnacle of Soviet aviation engineering. First flown in 1977, it entered service in 1983, specifically to counter the American F-15 Eagle and F-16 Fighting Falcon. With its twin engines producing 18,300 pounds of thrust each, the MiG-29 could reach speeds of Mach 2.25. Its Phasotron radar could track 10 targets simultaneously and engage 2. Armed with a 30mm cannon and capable of carrying R-73 and R-27 air-to-air missiles, the Fulcrum was designed for one purpose: to shoot down NATO aircraft in a European war that everyone prayed would never come. By 1989, Zuyev had logged hundreds of hours in the MiG-29. His superiors considered him reliable, skilled, politically sound. He was married to the daughter of an Air Division Chief of Staff, a connection that should have guaranteed his career trajectory. On paper, Captain Aleksandr Zuyev was living the Soviet dream. The reality was darker. "I was trained to defend my people, but not to kill them," Zuyev would later tell American debriefers. This statement contained everything: his disillusionment, his breaking point, his justification for what he was about to do. The Soviet Union in 1989 was fracturing. Mikhail Gorbachev's policies of Glasnost and perestroika had opened cracks in the totalitarian facade. People were questioning. Republics were stirring. And in the Georgian SSR, where Zuyev was stationed, tensions between Moscow and local populations were reaching a breaking point. On April 9, 1989, just 41 days before Zuyev's defection, Soviet army troops attacked peaceful pro-independence demonstrators in Tbilisi, the Georgian capital. The protesters had gathered in front of the government house on Rustaveli Avenue, demanding greater autonomy from Moscow. They sang songs. They carried banners. They were unarmed. At 4 a.m., Interior Ministry troops and paratroopers from the Transcaucasian Military District moved in. They used sharpened shovels, entrenching tools that doubled as brutal melee weapons. They deployed toxic gas, later identified as chloropicrin and CS gas. When the morning sun rose over Tbilisi, 21 people were dead. 16 women, including a 15-year-old girl. 5 men. Hundreds more were hospitalized with chemical exposure and traumatic injuries. The Soviet government immediately launched a propaganda campaign, claiming the demonstrators had been violent provocateurs. State television showed carefully edited footage. Official reports spoke of hooligans and anti-Soviet elements. But the truth spread anyway, through whispers and underground networks that no amount of censorship could silence. The victims had been peaceful. The attack had been premeditated. The violence had been extreme. For Zuyev, stationed at an air base in Georgia, the massacre hit close to home. "They were peaceful demonstrators," he said in later interviews. "I was shocked to the depths of my soul by the brutal slaughter that the army inflicted on the defenseless people. The shock deepened when word filtered through military channels that pilots, his fellow officers, might be called upon to support future crackdowns. Helicopters had been used in Tbilisi. Fixed-wing aircraft might be next. The thought of dropping bombs or firing cannons on civilians in the name of maintaining order became Zuyev's red line. He'd already been questioning Soviet ideology for years. The 1983 downing of Korean Airlines Flight 007, which killed all 216 passengers, had disturbed him deeply. Zuyev later claimed he'd learned from a radar operator that Soviet air defenses on Kamchatka had been disabled by Arctic storms 10 days before the incident. But local officials had lied to Moscow about repairs. The cover-up prevented proper identification of the civilian aircraft before a Soviet Su-15 shot it down. The lie, the deaths, the propaganda afterward claiming it was a spy plane. Everything rotted from within. His personal life offered no refuge. His marriage to the Chief of Staff's daughter had soured. Aviation author Yefim Gordon later documented that Zuyev had been suspended for poor discipline and that his superiors were considering dishonorable discharge. Whether this was cause or effect of his disillusionment remains unclear. What is certain? By May 1989, Captain Aleksandr Zuyev had decided he would not remain in the Soviet Union. And if he was leaving, he was taking one of their most valuable assets with him. Planning a defection from a Soviet air base in 1989 required solving an impossible equation. The aircraft were guarded. Fellow pilots would scramble to intercept him. Air defense radar blanketed the Black Sea region. Turkey, the nearest NATO country, sat 240 kilometers across the water, close enough to reach, far enough to be shot down en route. Every previous defector had faced these challenges. Some succeeded. Many died trying. Zuyev studied the cases he knew about. Viktor Belenko had defected with a MiG-29 to Japan in 1976, taking advantage of his authorized clearance for a training flight near the border. But Belenko had flown in broad daylight, during an authorized mission, with fuel for the journey. Zuyev would have none of these advantages. He needed to neutralize the base's ability to respond, steal an aircraft that wasn't fueled or armed for a mission, and disappear before anyone could stop him. The solution came from an unexpected place: his kitchen. Sleeping pills were relatively easy to obtain. Cake mix was available in the commissary. The plan crystallized with brutal simplicity. Drug everyone who could stop him, then move quickly while they were incapacitated. On May 19, 1989, Zuyev baked his cake. He crushed a massive quantity of sleeping medication. Sources vary on the exact type. But the dose was intended to incapacitate fully grown men for hours, and mixed it thoroughly into the strawberry batter. Then he announced his Good news. His wife was pregnant with a boy. In Soviet military culture, this called for celebration. His comrades would expect a party. Zuyev's target list was surgical. He served cake to 18 men, pilots, ground crew, support staff, 4 people he deliberately excluded. The regimental commander was working on flight plans and wasn't present. 2 mechanics were on guard duty at the flight line. 1 unit member was expected at another base. These 4 would remain conscious. But by the time they realized what was happening, Zuyev calculated, it would be too late. The party lasted into the night. Men ate their cake, toasted the expectant father, joked about the coming child. Within an hour, the sleeping pills began taking effect. Men grew drowsy. Conversation slowed. One by one, they succumbed to what they assumed was exhaustion after a long day. Zuyev watched and waited, his stomach tight with tension, knowing that if anyone suspected, if the dosage was wrong, if just one person sounded an alarm, everything would collapse. By 10:30 p.m., 18 men were unconscious. Zuyev moved quickly. He located the base's telephone lines and cut them with wire cutters, severing communication with higher command and neighboring units. The night was dark, overcast. Good flying weather for someone who didn't want to be seen. He changed into his flight suit, checked his pistol, and walked toward the aircraft parking area where the MiG-29 sat in their reinforced shelters. 2 sentries guarded the MiG-29 flight line. They were the mechanics Zuyev had deliberately excluded from his party, professionals who took their duty seriously. When Zuyev approached in the darkness, one of them challenged him. Why was the captain out here at this hour? Where was his authorization? The questions were routine. The answers weren't. Zuyev attempted deception first, claiming he was relieving someone, that there had been a scheduling mix-up. The guard, sources identify him as a mechanic who had returned after finding the others asleep, wasn't convinced. Something was wrong. Why was everyone unconscious? Why were the phones dead? The confrontation escalated. When I was in school, I was a wrestler, Zuyev later recalled. Once, I won the championship. I was pretty confident that it would be so easy to tie him up. You won't believe it, but he was a wrestler too. He was pretty good. The 2 men grappled in the darkness beside a $25 million fighter jet. Zuyev was fit, trained in hand-to-hand combat as all pilots were. But the mechanic was strong, motivated by duty and suspicion. They fought on the concrete, wrestling for control. Then the mechanic broke free and drew his sidearm. Shots cracked across the airfield. Zuyev fired his Makarov pistol, hitting the guard multiple times. The mechanic returned fire, hitting Zuyev in the right arm. Blood soaked through the flight suit sleeve. Pain lanced up from the wound. But Zuyev couldn't stop. The shots would alert the base commander, the alert pilots, anyone still conscious. He had minutes at most. Leaving the wounded mechanic behind, the man would survive. Zuyev ran to the nearest MiG-29. Not just any aircraft. He chose one that had been in storage, not on active duty status. This MiG-29 hadn't flown recently. Tarpaulin still covered parts of it. It wasn't fueled for a combat mission. It was, from any reasonable perspective, the worst possible choice for a desperate escape attempt. But it was accessible, and the guns were armed, and Zuyev was bleeding and running out of time. He climbed into the cockpit, his wounded arm screaming with every movement. Blood made the controls slippery. The MiG-29's startup procedure required precise steps: master power, hydraulics, fuel pumps, engine igniters. Zuyev had performed this sequence hundreds of times, but never while wounded, never while base security was scrambling, never knowing that discovery meant immediate execution. The first engine failed to start. Zuyev tried again, forcing himself to slow down, to follow the checklist burned into his memory. The starter whined. The turbofan spooled up. First the right engine, then the left. The Klimov RD-33 turbofans roared to life, each producing 18,300 pounds of thrust. The canopy came down, sealing him inside. I thought, this is it. This is really the end of my life, Zuyev recalled. He could see base personnel running toward the flight line. Lights were coming on across Gudauta. The commander would be calling higher headquarters, except the phones were cut. Confusion bought seconds. Seconds were all he needed. Zuyev released the brakes and taxied toward the runway, the MiG-29 still trailing pieces of protective tarpaulin. His original plan had included destroying the other aircraft on the ground, denying the Soviet Air Force their most advanced fighters, and preventing immediate pursuit. He armed the 30mm GSH-31 cannon, which carried 150 rounds. But in his haste, or perhaps in shock from the gunshot wound, Zuyev forgot to remove one of the two safety locks. The gun wouldn't fire. The other MiG-29s remained intact, their pilots now waking to alarms and running for their aircraft. There was no time to fix the lock. Zuyev pushed the throttles forward, and the Fulcrum accelerated down the runway, its nose wheel lifting at 180 knots, the aircraft clawing into the night sky over the Black Sea. Behind him, Gudauta Air Base erupted in chaos. Ahead lay 240 kilometers of water, Turkish airspace, and freedom, if he could survive the next 30 minutes. The Black Sea at night is a void. No lights, no landmarks, just darkness above and below, with Soviet air defense radar painting every move. Zuyev had no flight plan, no authorization code, no transponder showing him as friendly. He was flying a MiG-29 Fulcrum, the Soviet Union's most advanced fighter, on an unauthorized trajectory toward NATO airspace. Every Soviet and Warsaw Pact radar operator from Crimea to Bulgaria was watching him. Every air defense commander was calculating intercept vectors. Zuyev knew the procedures intimately. He'd trained for them. Scramble orders would go out to intercept stations. Pairs of MiG-29s, MiG-23s, or Su-27s would launch. They would identify him visually, signal him to turn back, and if he refused, as he absolutely would refuse, they would have authorization to shoot. Not to disable, not to force landing. To kill. A defecting pilot flying a state-of-the-art fighter was the highest priority target the Soviet Air Force could face, short of an American bomber penetrating Soviet airspace. He flew low and fast, weaving between hills and valleys where possible, using terrain masking to break radar lock. The MiG-29's terrain-following radar, designed to let pilots strike NATO ground targets while avoiding enemy radar, now helped Zuyev avoid his own country's air defenses. He passed familiar Soviet air bases, places he'd visited, fields where friends were stationed. Any of them could scramble interceptors. The wound in his right arm made every control input painful. Blood loss brought dizziness. The MiG-29's cockpit, spacious by Soviet standards, felt claustrophobic. Fuel gauges dropped steadily. The stored aircraft hadn't been fully fueled. Zuyev calculated distances, speeds, fuel consumption. The math was brutal. He might have just enough to reach Turkey. He might not. Soviet ground controllers attempted radio contact. Zuyev ignored them. They would be ordering him to return, threatening consequences, perhaps even lying about bogus emergencies to trick him back. Western intelligence agencies listening to Soviet military frequencies that night recorded urgent communications between air defense commands. A priority alert. An unauthorized aircraft, heading southwest toward Turkey. All available interceptors scrambled. But Zuyev had advantages. He knew Soviet intercept procedures because he'd trained in them. He knew radar coverage gaps because he'd exploited them in exercises. He knew his fellow pilots because they were his friends, his squadron mates. men who at that moment were climbing into cockpits, wondering if they'd have to shoot down Captain Aleksandr Zuyev. That hesitation, the human factor, the split-second question of whether to fire on someone you knew, bought precious seconds. 15 minutes into the flight, Zuyev crossed into international airspace over the Black Sea. Soviet jurisdiction ended. Turkish airspace began. But the Soviet Air Force had shown repeatedly, from the shoot-down of Cal 007 to countless Cold War incidents, that international law was flexible when state security was at stake. Interceptors could follow him into Turkish airspace. They could fire and claim navigational error or defense of national interests. They could kill him, and the truth might never emerge. The Turkish coast appeared on his radar screen. Mountains rose ahead. Trabzon lay beyond them, a Black Sea port city with an airport. Zuyev had memorized the location, the runway heading, the approach path. He'd studied maps until he could navigate there in his sleep. Now, bleeding and exhausted, he would test that preparation. He keyed his radio to international emergency frequency. Trabzon Tower. This is Soviet aircraft requesting emergency landing. The tower controllers must have thought they were hallucinating. A MiG-29, a fighter they'd only seen in intelligence photographs, declaring emergency and requesting to land. Was it a defector? An attack? A navigational error? Zuyev descended toward Trabzon Airport, his fuel gauges showing critical levels. The MiG-29 wasn't designed for long-range missions. It was an interceptor, meant to scramble, fight, and return to base within an hour. He'd pushed the aircraft beyond its mission profile. The engines were still running. That was all that mattered. At 240 kilometers from Gudauta, approximately 30 minutes after takeoff, Captain Aleksandr Zuyev of the Soviet Air Force landed a MiG-29 Fulcrum at Trabzon Airport, Turkey. Shreds of tarpaulin still clung to the aircraft. Blood soaked the cockpit. As the fighter rolled to a stop and Zuyev shut down the engines, a lone Turkish security guard approached carefully, uncertain what he was witnessing. Zuyev slid back the canopy. His first words, according to multiple sources, were, "Finally, an American." He'd spoken them in English, one of the only phrases he knew. The guard, speaking English, smiled with relief. The American embassy would be notified. Zuyev, then 28 years old, had succeeded where so many others had failed. His next words were simpler. "Take me to hospital." The MiG-29, sitting on Turkish tarmac, instantly became the most valuable piece of military hardware in the Middle East. The Soviet Union had deployed Fulcrums to frontline aviation units starting in 1983. But NATO had never obtained one for close examination. Western intelligence knew the MiG-29 specifications from observation, from satellite photography, from defector debriefs. But they'd never touched one, never tested its radar, never examined its avionics suite, never measured the performance of its engines. Now one sat in Turkey, a NATO member, but one with complicated relationships with both Moscow and Washington. Turkish officials immediately faced impossible choices: return the aircraft and maintain good relations with the Soviet Union, examine it and risk Soviet anger, turn it over to the Americans and become a target of Soviet retaliation. The Soviet response came within hours. The Soviet embassy in Ankara contacted Turkish foreign ministry officials with a straightforward message: return the aircraft immediately. The pilot, they claimed, was mentally unstable, possibly drugged, certainly not acting of his own free will. The defection was a criminal act, not a political statement. Turkey, as a responsible neighbor, should return both pilot and aircraft. Turkish officials quickly agreed to the Soviet request regarding the aircraft. A spokesman emphasized Ankara's wish to maintain good relations with the Soviet Union, particularly important as Glasnost created new diplomatic opportunities. But there was a problem. While Turkish authorities were negotiating the MiG-29's return, American intelligence officers were negotiating access to Captain Zuyev. Zuyev underwent surgery at Trabzon University Hospital for the gunshot wound in his right arm. Turkish security guards stood watch outside his room, protecting him or preventing his escape, depending on interpretation. CIA operatives arrived separately, offering protection, asylum in the United States, and debriefing about Soviet military capabilities. Soviet officials demanded access to their kidnapped pilot. Turkish doctors focused on treating a patient who'd been shot. The compromise pleased no one, but satisfied everyone's immediate needs. Turkey would return the MiG-29 to the Soviet Union. A Soviet aircraft with technicians arrived at Trabzon expecting to fly the fighter home, but Turkish air traffic controllers refused landing permission initially. The diplomatic dance continued for a day until arrangements were finalized. The Soviets would get their aircraft, escorted out of Turkish airspace by Turkish Air Force jets. But Zuyev wouldn't be on it. That same night, before Soviet officials could press their claim, a United States Air Force C-130 Hercules transport landed at Trabzon. Turkish authorities quietly allowed American personnel to remove Zuyev, wounded but alive, and fly him to Ramstein Air Base in West Germany. The evacuation occurred so quickly that Soviet diplomats were still negotiating access when they learned their defector was gone. The MiG-29 returned to Soviet hands the next afternoon, but the propaganda value was already lost. The world knew a Soviet pilot had drugged his squadron, fought his way to a fighter jet, and escaped to NATO. The story was too dramatic, too damning of Soviet military security, too perfect an illustration of Glasnost's failures. Soviet state media tried to spin the narrative. Zuyev was mentally unstable, driven by personal problems not representative of Soviet military morale. But the facts spoke louder. Turkish officials charged Zuyev with hijacking, a criminal offense under Turkish law. The charges were dismissed for political reasons, the court finding his actions political rather than criminal in nature. This legal fiction allowed Turkey to avoid extraditing him while maintaining plausible deniability with Moscow. Everyone understood the game being played. At Ramstein Air Base, then at various secure facilities across the United States, Zuyev underwent 5 months of intensive debriefing. CIA and Defense Intelligence Agency officers, Air Force pilots, and aeronautical engineers all wanted to know everything. MiG-29 capabilities, Soviet air defense procedures, training methods, morale problems, technological weaknesses. Zuyev proved remarkably cooperative. Unlike some defectors who held back information as bargaining chips, he answered questions fully. He provided technical details about the MiG-29's phasotron radar limitations, its infrared search and track system, the vulnerabilities in its electronic warfare suite. He explained Soviet intercept tactics, their assumptions about NATO formations, their training against simulated American aircraft. Most valuable were his insights into Soviet military culture in the Glasnost era, the infrastructure problems at remote bases, the morale issues among junior officers, the political officers who controlled careers, the corruption that permeated supply chains, the pilots who questioned orders, the growing disconnect between Moscow's propaganda and soldiers' reality. American military planners absorbed these details eagerly. When Operation Desert Storm commenced in January 1991, Zuyev worked as a CIA consultant helping American pilots detect and counter Iraqi MiG-29s, the same aircraft he'd flown. His knowledge of radar signatures, engagement parameters, and tactical doctrine proved invaluable. Iraqi MiG-29 pilots, trained by Soviets in Soviet methods, faced American F-15s, whose pilots had been briefed by a former Soviet MiG-29 driver. The Iraqi Fulcrums stood no chance. Zuyev's most controversial claim came in January 1993, concerning Korean Airlines Flight Uru-7, the passenger jet shot down by a Soviet Su-15 in 1983. Zuyev stated publicly that Arctic storms had disabled Soviet radar systems on Kamchatka 10 days before the incident, and that local officials had lied to Moscow about the repairs. This meant Soviet air defenses couldn't properly track or identify the aircraft, directly contributing to the tragedy. Zuyev claimed he learned this from a radar operator stationed on Sakhalin Island during the shootdown. The Soviet government never acknowledged this claim, but it aligned with known equipment vulnerabilities and the culture of deception Zuyev had described. Back at Gudauta Air Base, 18 men woke in hospital beds, confused and sick. The sleeping pills Zuyev had mixed into his strawberry cake required immediate medical intervention. 7 men, those who'd eaten the most cake, were seriously incapacitated and remained hospitalized for days. The Soviet military medical service treated what amounted to mass poisoning, trying to stabilize pilots and ground crew who'd been drugged by their own comrade. All 7 fully recovered physically. The psychological damage ran deeper. They'd been betrayed by someone they trusted, someone they'd celebrated with hours before. The cake they'd enjoyed contained enough sedatives to potentially kill them if the dosage had been miscalculated. Zuyev had essentially used his friends as pawns in his escape plan, accepting their hospitalization as collateral damage. Soviet military prosecutors investigated everyone connected to Zuyev's defection. The mechanics who'd been on guard duty, the commander who'd been preparing flight plans, fellow pilots who'd known Zuyev personally. Anyone who might have suspected, might have helped, might have turned a blind eye. The paranoia that defined Soviet military culture intensified. If a trusted MiG-29 pilot could defect, drugging his entire squadron in the process, who else might be planning escape? Aviation author Yefim Gordon's 2007 book, Mikoyan MiG-29, was sharply critical of Zuyev, citing his prior suspension for poor discipline and noting that his superiors had been considering dishonorable discharge before the defection. Gordon speculated this career threat spurred Zuyev's decision to flee, suggesting personal failure rather than ideological opposition motivated the defection. Soviet, Russian narratives consistently emphasized this angle. Zuyev was a troubled officer, not a political dissident. His actions were criminal, not heroic. The guard Zuyev shot during his escape, the wrestler mechanic who'd fought him at the flight line, survived his wounds, but faced intensive questioning about how he'd failed to stop the defection. Soviet military logic demanded accountability. Someone had to be blamed. Usually, it was everyone, except the leadership who'd created conditions where skilled officers wanted to flee. The United States granted Zuyev political asylum quickly. Congress enacted special legislation, private law, similar to what Viktor Belenko received, authorizing citizenship. Zuyev settled in San Diego, California, adopted an American identity, and attempted to build a life far from the Soviet Union that had shaped and ultimately betrayed him. In 1992, Zuyev co-authored Fulcrum, a Top Gun pilot's escape from the Soviet Empire, with Malcolm McConnell. The book detailed his life in the Soviet Air Force, his growing disillusionment, the planning of his defection, and his first years in America. It became a valuable primary source for understanding Soviet military culture in the Glasnost era, not from the perspective of generals or politicians, but from a frontline pilot who'd lived it. The book revealed telling details about Zuyev's personal life. His marriage to the Air Division Chief of Staff's daughter had been strained for years. She'd been connected, privileged within the Soviet military aristocracy. He'd been the talented pilot who'd married up. When the marriage collapsed, Zuyev lost not just a wife, but also the political protection that came with military family connections. On October 26, 1992, Zuyev's second child was born in the United States. He gave up parental rights almost immediately. This detail, recorded in his Wikipedia biography, suggests his adjustment to American life was troubled. defectors often struggled with isolation, cultural displacement, and trauma from their escapes. Zuyev had killed, or seriously wounded, a guard, drugged 18 men, stolen an aircraft, and fled his homeland. These actions, however justified by his circumstances, carried psychological weight. Zuyev opened a consulting firm, leveraging his knowledge of Soviet aviation and military systems. He worked with aerospace companies and government agencies, always careful about security given that Russian intelligence services had long memories and longer reach. Viktor Belenko, the MiG-29 defector, feared for his life until his death in 2023. Zuyev surely understood the risks. On June 10, 2001, 12 years after his dramatic defection, Aleksandr Zuyev died in an aircraft crash near Bellingham, Washington. He was flying a Yakovlev Yak-52, a Soviet-era trainer aircraft, ironically, the same type he'd learned to fly in as a young cadet. The aircraft entered a spin and crashed, killing Zuyev and another aviator, Jerry Mike Warren. Zuyev was 39 years old, exactly the age many fighter pilots begin transitioning to training roles or desk jobs. He died flying, which perhaps was fitting for someone whose entire life had revolved around aircraft. The crash investigation found no evidence of sabotage, no indication of foul play. It appeared to be a tragic accident, a stall, a spin, insufficient altitude to recover. But the timing haunted observers. Zuyev had survived the most dangerous defection of the late Cold War era. He'd fought through a shootout, stolen a MiG-29, evaded Soviet interceptors, and escaped to freedom. He'd rebuilt his life in America, consulted for intelligence agencies, helped defeat Iraqi MiG-29s in Desert Storm. And then he died in a training aircraft in Washington state, in a routine flight gone wrong. Russian media occasionally published stories about Zuyev's death, often with insinuations. Soviet justice had its ways. Traitors eventually faced consequences. These stories were impossible to verify or disprove, existing in the murky space between propaganda and possibility. What's certain, Aleksandr Zuyev's defection cost him everything: his homeland, his family, his sense of belonging, and ultimately, in a Yak-52 that morning in 2001, his life. Zuyev's defection represented more than one pilot's escape. It symbolized the collapse of Soviet ideological certainty that Glasnost and Perestroika had accelerated. The Soviet system had spent decades building a military elite, educated, trained, trusted with nuclear-capable aircraft and state secrets. These weren't conscripts or dissidents. These were the success stories, the model Soviet citizens who had everything to gain by loyalty. When someone like Aleksandr Zuyev, 28 years old, flying the Air Force's most advanced fighter, married into military aristocracy, chose to drug his squadron and flee, it revealed fundamental rot, not just in military security procedures, though those were clearly inadequate, but in the entire premise that Soviet society offered something worth preserving, that the system deserved allegiance, that the sacrifices demanded of its citizens served a noble purpose. The immediate security changes were predictable. Soviet military bases tightened access to aircraft. Background checks intensified. Political officers increased surveillance of pilots, showing any signs of disaffection. But these measures addressed symptoms, not causes. The real problem wasn't insufficient surveillance. It was that skilled officers with everything to lose looked at the Soviet Union and decided escape, even at enormous personal risk, was preferable to staying. NATO, and particularly American military aviation, benefited significantly from Zuyev's knowledge. The MiG-29's capabilities and limitations, previously inferred from observation, became precisely known. Soviet intercept tactics, air defense procedures, pilot training methods. all entered Western intelligence databases, informing everything from aircraft design to combat tactics. When Desert Storm demonstrated American air superiority so overwhelmingly, Zuyev's contributions were classified but significant. The broader symbolic impact mattered more. Cold War defections by pilots had occurred regularly since 1953, when Polish Air Force Lieutenant Franciszek Jarecki flew a MiG-29 to Denmark. But Zuyev's 1989 defection came at a critical moment. The Berlin Wall would fall 6 months later. The Soviet Union would collapse 2 years after that. His escape illustrated vividly what Glasnost had revealed: that for many Soviet citizens, particularly educated professionals who could compare propaganda to reality, the system had lost legitimacy. The drugged squadron became metaphor. The Soviet military, like those 18 pilots, had consumed something sweet that masked poison. Decades of propaganda about inevitable communist victory, about the socialist paradise, about Western decadence. They'd believed it, or at least pretended to believe it, because everyone else was consuming the same lies. And then, like Zuyev's comrades waking in hospital beds, they realized they'd been betrayed by the very system they'd served. 23 years after his death, Aleksandr Zuyev's defection still raises uncomfortable questions. Was he a hero or a criminal? A freedom fighter or a traitor? The answer depends entirely on perspective. From the American viewpoint, Zuyev risked everything to escape tyranny and provide valuable intelligence about Soviet military capabilities. His information helped protect NATO pilots and contributed to ending the Cold War without nuclear holocaust. He deserved asylum, citizenship, and gratitude. From the Russian viewpoint, Zuyev was an oath-breaker who drugged fellow servicemen, shot a guard, stole state property, and defected to the enemy. His actions endangered Soviet security and betrayed the nation that had educated and trusted him. He deserved prosecution, not celebration. From Zuyev's own perspective, articulated in his book and interviews, he faced an impossible choice: remain in a system he no longer believed in, potentially ordered to kill civilians during crackdowns like Tbilisi, or escape to a country whose values, however imperfectly realized, aligned better with his conscience. He chose escape, accepting the moral weight of drugging friends and shooting a guard as the cost of freedom. The sleeping pill cake remains the most memorable detail: audacious, ruthless, effective. It demonstrated sophisticated planning and absolute commitment. Zuyev didn't just decide to defect one day and steal an aircraft. He prepared meticulously, identified obstacles, developed solutions, and executed flawlessly under extreme pressure. These were exactly the qualities the Soviet Air Force had trained into him. The system created the tool that destroyed it. Modern discussions of defection often romanticize the concept, forgetting the human costs. Zuyev's wife remained in the Soviet Union, presumably facing suspicion and investigation. His family dealt with the shame of having a defector relative. The 7 men he hospitalized recovered physically, but carried psychological scars. The guard he shot suffered permanent consequences. Freedom isn't free, the cliché goes, but the price gets paid by more than just the person escaping. The MiG-29 that Zuyev flew to Trabzon returned to Soviet hands quickly, but its message spread globally. In an era before YouTube and social media, the defection still captured international attention. A Soviet pilot drugging his squadron with cake and stealing a cutting-edge fighter jet was too dramatic, too symbolic, too perfect a Cold War story to ignore. For Soviet-Russian aviation, the MiG-29 continued service long after Zuyev's defection, becoming one of the most widely exported fighters in history. But the Fulcrum never entirely escaped association with that May night in 1989. Every MiG-29 pilot afterward knew that one of their predecessors had taken that same aircraft, flown it across the Black Sea, and never looked back. The Tbilisi massacre that triggered Zuyev's final decision demonstrated how Glasnost created impossible contradictions. Gorbachev's policies opened information flows and loosened ideological control, but didn't address the fundamental tensions within the Soviet Empire. When Georgian citizens exercised their supposedly guaranteed rights to peaceful assembly and free expression, the Soviet response was shovels and gas and death. This contradiction, freedom promised but denied, radicalized people who might otherwise have remained loyal. Captain Aleksandr Mikhailovich Zuyev, born into the Soviet system, trained by it, trusted by it, ultimately rejected it so completely that he risked death to escape. His strawberry cake, laced with sleeping pills, put 18 men in the hospital and changed his life forever. His gunfight with a guard left blood on both men. His flight across the Black Sea in a stolen MiG-29 Fulcrum demonstrated that even the most sophisticated security apparatus couldn't control human desire for freedom. In the end, Zuyev's defection wasn't just about one pilot or one aircraft. It was about a system that inspired so much fear and resentment in its own elite that an officer would rather drug his friends, shoot his comrades, and flee to uncertain exile than remain. That desperation, multiplied across millions of people, would bring down the Soviet Union within 2 years of Zuyev's escape. The cake was strawberry, the sleeping pills were bitter, and the taste of freedom, Zuyev discovered, came at a price higher than he'd imagined, but still worth paying.